Adding piping to a project, I think, gives a really professional finish, whether that's quilt making, homewares, making bags. Basically, you're putting a little bit of dimension and texture into a seam. So normally you'd see it on things like cushion covers. It could be the trim on a Roman blind, on curtains, and even in tailoring. What about around pockets? Very fine piping around collars and revers on jackets. And certainly if you're going to be making any kind of quilts, the piping doesn't just have to be around the edge of the quilt. You can incorporate that into part of the makeup of the quilt as well. But to make your own piping is very, very simple when you know how. So basically what you're going to need is your piping cord. And piping cord comes in lots of different sizes. I tend to use either 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch piping, but it can be very, very fine. It can be a lot thicker than this as well. And it's basically a piece of cotton cording that you encapsulate inside a piece of fabric. Your fabric is normally cut on the bias, so that means it's been cut at a 45-degree angle, very much like bias binding. And literally you're going to take your piping cord and wrap your fabric around there. So you'll make up the cord separately to applying it to your project. So let's do just that. You can buy piping cord feet for your sewing machine. I find it just as easy, if you don't have one already, to just use the zipper foot on your sewing machine. I also find it easier not to pin, but if you care to pin, then that's entirely up to you. So take your fabric, and this one is already pre-cut. So I've got a piece of fabric which is 1.5 inches across and my 1/4 of an inch bias binding. And you're going to wrap the fabric around the piping cord until the raw edges meet. Then take this over to the sewing machine, and using the zipper foot on your sewing machine, we're going to sew a straight line all the way down the side. Now at this point, I'm not too concerned about having a very, very tight line of stitches up against the piping cord, because we'll do that when we sew this into the project. What's more important at the moment is that these two raw edges of the fabric, as it's folded over, line up perfectly. So just using the side of my zipper foot pushed up against the cord, I'm going to go straight down. Now the reason that you're going to use fabric which is cut on the bias is that when you take your cord around a curve or even around a corner, because I'll show you in just a second, your corners won't be a 90-degree corner, they will naturally fall into a curve. If your fabric is cut on the bias, then it's not going to crease and it's not going to pucker, so you get a much neater line. What you also need to take into account is your seam allowance, because the seam allowance is going to be the difference between the edge of your piping fabric and your piping cord. I'll explain that again in just a second. Now always sew more than you actually need, so if you've measured your project already, then add at least a couple of inches to the length, because I'm also going to show you how you join your piping together to make it look really neat. So again, all I'm doing here is lining up the raw edges and sewing that straight line. To be honest, if your edges aren't lined up perfectly, you can trim this back afterwards. There you go. But it's always better to get it right first time. Very much like with bias binding, if you're joining two pieces of fabric together, then join them at a 45-degree angle, because that diagonal seam will draw less attention than a seam that goes straight across. But you'll see more information in any videos about bias binding that I've already brought you. I think we have about enough there. Let's finish this little bit, and then I'll show you how to apply. Okay, so if I was going to be putting this piping around a cushion cover, I like to start applying the bias binding right in the middle of one of the sides, and if your fabric is directional, the bottom side would be the best one to go for, because that's going to be the most out of sight, if you like. So if that's the bottom, I'm going to take the end of my bias tape, wrapped around my piping cord, remember, and I'm just going to open up some of the stitches on the end. So I've now got an exposed little bit on the end of here. And I'm just going to leave that. I'm going to make that around about 1 inch long so you can see clearly what I'm doing. I'm going to leave that open until I bring the piping cord all the way back round to where I'm starting. So again, just starting in the centre, raw edges together, and on the right side of your fabric we're going to start to sew. So again, if you wanted to pin, then pin into the seam allowance. You can pin all the way around if you like. I find it easier not to. And I'll show you why as we start to approach the corners. So again, I'm not starting to sew right at the end of my piping. I'm starting around about 1 inch in. And I'm going to move my needle over to the left-hand side slightly, just so that my stitch line is now inside the line that I'm already sewing. When I sew the second piece of fabric on the top, that's when I'll take the needle right over to the edge of the piping, and that'll make it look nice and neat. So when I'm just coming up to the corner here, I'm just going to stop a couple of inches away from the corner, because if I try and bend this fabric around the corner of my my cushion cover, it's just, well, it's not going to work. So I need to put a little vent in there, or a little gap inside. So as I'm coming up to the edge here, my seam allowance is 1/4 inch, so I'm going to stop about 1/4 inch from here, and I need to make a snip halfway down there. You don't have to mark this every single time, that's just so that you can see what I'm doing. And I'm literally going to cut into that seam allowance up to the stitches, not through them, just up to them. So now when I come into the corner, and it won't ever be a right angle corner, as I said previously, stop with the needle down, make sure you've got that same seam allowance, so be careful as you come around here, and then we're going to bend, up you go, bend my piping cord round, keeping that nice and tight, and then again follow that cord closely around the corner. And we'll do this in all 4 corners until we come back to the beginning. So again, stop now, I can see where the corner is. I'm just going to snip into this corner. You can make a couple of snips or more if you like. That's not, you know, nobody's counting, make as many as you need to. Stop, lift up, needle down, turn around, and then carry on sewing. Right, now this is where I'm coming back up to where I started. So I'm going to leave my cord overlapping. I will trim this down again shortly. And sew to around about 1 inch from where the overlap's going to be. So that's my overlapping fabric, and I've trimmed down the cord on the inside so that the 2 pieces of cord meet each other. So in other words, unpick a little bit of this if you need to, expose the cord that's on the inside here, and trim that back so that the 2 ends meet. So in that end, the cord goes right up to the end of the bias tape, and this end is going to meet it. The fabric that covers the cord on that side where I started is longer. And that's because now I need to fold over the end of the fabric to make it neat. Don't worry about having to unpick even more of this fabric if you need to, because we're going to sew over that again in just a second. And then if I just turn this around, you may be able to see better. I need to fit one side of the bias tape inside the other so it wraps around, so you get a nice neat join like so. Now when I've finished, if you want to, well, if I wanted to, I could sew around that little bit by hand. I don't really see the need because it's not going to come undone, but that's an option for you if you wish. Then we'll take this back to the sewing machine again and re-sew over that line that I've just unpicked. There's my join. And from the outside, that's what it's going to look like. So that's nice and neat and straight. Right, so let's show you how to do the corners when you sew the two pieces of fabric that you have right sides together. So we'll line up the edges again. Remember, I've got one corner now which wants to be round, and my backing fabric wants to be square. So it may feel as though the two pieces don't line up, but they will do. So I'll just put a couple of pins in here because I'm just going to show you the corner. Now, still with the zipper foot on my sewing machine, this time I've moved the needle over to as far as it'll go. And I'm sewing from the back of the fabric so I can already see the stitch line that I've already made, because I want to make sure that I'm sewing inside that stitch line. So as close as I can to the cord without actually sewing through the cord, I'm going to sew all the way around again. Just keep those edges together. And then when I'm coming into the corner, remember these stitches are round. So keep that as flat as I can. And I'm just keeping that needle as tight to the cord as I possibly can. Now the first time you do this, I can guarantee you won't be close enough, but that's okay because I'll show you what to do to rectify it. So just around the side here, and we'll just sew a few more stitches. So obviously you'd go all the way around. So let me just take these pins out, and we'll turn this the right side out, and I'll show you the corner. So there's my piping, which is sitting very nicely, and there's my corner. Now if you find that you can still see some stitches on the inside, or you needed to go a little bit tighter to the piping, at this stage all you're going to do is to turn your fabric the wrong side out again and re-sew as tight as you can all the way around, and just keep doing that until you get that absolutely perfect finish. And when you do, I think you've got a really lovely, professional, satisfying, rewarding finish to your work.